Prince Andrew had a lease that was supposed to keep him in his royal mansion until 2078. Instead, within just 6 months, he lost every royal home he had. No dramatic eviction, no court battle, just a quiet demonstration of how the monarchy can reclaim power from one of its own, and why, inside the royal family, trust is ultimately worth more than any lease. He had a lease that ran until 2078. On paper, Prince Andrew still had 53 years left in a 30-room mansion, paying a rent of just one peppercorn a year if anyone ever bothered to collect it. That isn't a figure of speech or a piece of royal folklore. It was the actual legal arrangement governing Royal Lodge, one of the most valuable residences on the Windsor estate. By any ordinary standard, a lease running for decades should have made his position almost untouchable. Contracts like that are supposed to provide certainty. They're designed to outlast governments, family disputes, and changes in circumstance. Yet by April 2026, none of those legal protections seem to matter anymore. The man who had signed that lease no longer lived there. In fact, he no longer occupied any royal residence at all. Over the course of just a few months, Prince Andrew watched every property connected to his royal life slip away, one after another, until there was nothing left to surrender. No dramatic eviction, no court order forcing him onto the street, no public legal battle over ownership. Instead, the process unfolded quietly, through financial pressure, carefully timed decisions, and the slow withdrawal of institutional support. That's what makes this story so remarkable. On paper, Andrew appeared to hold one of the strongest residential positions inside the royal family. In reality, those protections proved far less permanent than they looked. His lease survived scandals, public outrage, and years of controversy, only to unravel once the institution itself decided it no longer had a reason to keep defending it. By the time he finally left Royal Lodge, the document that once seemed to guarantee his future there had become little more than a historical footnote. And the way that happened reveals something far more important than the downfall of one disgraced prince. It exposes how royal property really works once the interests of the crown and the interests of a family member stop pointing in the same direction. This is the story of how Andrew Mountbatten Windsor lost every single royal residence he ever held in the space of about 6 months, and how the family used something the public rarely gets to see, the actual machinery of royal property law, to do it. Here's where the story really begins. October 2025. Buckingham Palace releases a statement that, at first glance, looks like another carefully worded piece of royal correspondence. Read it more closely though, and it sounds less like a press release and more like a legal document. Every sentence is measured, every word appears chosen with extraordinary precision. Rather than simply announcing another adjustment to Prince Andrew's public role, the statement lays out the beginning of a formal constitutional and legal process. King Charles has initiated proceedings to remove his brother's remaining royal style, titles, and honors, bringing years of gradual separation from public royal life to their logical conclusion. The symbolic impact was enormous. Overnight, the public focus shifted from Prince Andrew to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. It was more than a change in how he was addressed. It was another clear signal that the institution intended to draw an unmistakable line between the monarchy and one of its most controversial members. For many people reading the announcement, that seemed like the main story. It dominated headlines, generated endless debate, and reinforced the message that Charles was continuing to distance the crown from his younger brother. But hidden inside that same palace statement was a sentence that attracted far less attention, and in hindsight, it was the sentence that mattered most. It wasn't about titles, it wasn't about honors, it was about Royal Lodge. Almost in passing, the palace acknowledged something that constitutional lawyers and property specialists immediately understood. Until that moment, Andrew's lease had provided him with genuine legal protection to remain in the mansion. The wording was unmistakable. The protection existed in the past tense. The statement then confirmed that formal notice had been served, requiring him to surrender the lease. That single sentence quietly changed the entire conversation. For years, many people assumed Andrew remained at Royal Lodge simply because the royal family allowed him to stay. The palace's own wording revealed a more complicated reality. He hadn't remained there solely because of family goodwill. He remained because he possessed a legally binding lease that gave him enforceable rights over the property. The monarchy couldn't simply decide one morning that he had to leave. However uncomfortable his continued residence had become, the legal agreement still existed, and it had to be dealt with through the proper process. The significance of that detail is easy to miss. Buckingham Palace wasn't announcing an eviction. It was acknowledging that a legal shield which had protected Andrew for more than 2 decades was now being deliberately dismantled. The process had moved beyond public relations and entered the realm of property law. From that point onward, the story was no longer simply about a disgraced royal losing favor with his family. It became a story about how the monarchy uses the law, private agreements, and centuries-old property arrangements to reshape its own future without ever appearing to break its own rules. And once that formal notice had been served, the countdown to Andrew's departure had effectively begun. Think about what that sentence is actually admitting. For over 20 years, nobody could touch Andrew's living arrangement, not because the family didn't want to, but because they legally couldn't. A lease is a lease. The Crown Estate can't just knock on the door and demand the mansion back because a scandal broke. It took a formal surrender process and the same kind of legal maneuvering Edward would later use as his shield in the Bagshot Park dispute. Except this time, the family was on the other side of it, and they were the ones doing the pressuring. So how does a man with a legally binding lease running to 2078 end up gone by Easter? The answer is money, and it's a detail that almost nobody outside royal finance circles paid much attention to at the time. Most people assumed that if King Charles wanted Andrew out of Royal Lodge, he would have needed some dramatic legal maneuver or a lengthy court battle. In reality, he didn't need either. He didn't seize the property. He didn't cancel the lease overnight. He didn't even challenge Andrew's legal right to occupy the house directly. Instead, he targeted something far more fundamental: the ability to afford living there in the first place. By the time Charles became king, Andrew had already lost much of what had once supported his royal lifestyle. His publicly funded police protection had been withdrawn. His honorary military appointments and royal patronages had been removed. His role as a working royal had effectively ended years earlier. Those decisions damaged his public standing, but they didn't force him out of Royal Lodge. The mansion remained his home because, on paper, his lease was still intact. The real leverage lay somewhere else entirely. For years, Charles had reportedly provided his younger brother with a substantial private allowance, widely reported to be around £1 million annually. Unlike taxpayer funding, this money came from Charles personally rather than directly from the public purse. It existed alongside the legal arrangements surrounding Royal Lodge and helped cover the enormous costs that come with maintaining one of the largest residences on the Windsor estate. Those costs are easy to underestimate. Royal Lodge is not an ordinary country house. It's a sprawling 30-room, Grade 2 listed mansion requiring constant maintenance, specialist repairs, extensive groundskeeping, security arrangements, insurance, utilities, and staffing. Even something as basic as heating a property of that size can cost an extraordinary amount over the course of a year. Historic buildings also demand continuous conservation work that simply doesn't exist in modern homes. The famous peppercorn rent attached to Andrew's lease may have sounded almost free, but the rent was never the expensive part. Keeping the property operational was, and that's where Charles's decision became so effective. If the private financial support disappeared, the economics of remaining at Royal Lodge changed almost overnight. A lease may guarantee someone's right to occupy a property, but it doesn't guarantee the ability to pay for everything that comes with living there. Without millions of pounds available to meet those ongoing obligations, even the strongest lease begins to lose much of its practical value. That's why describing what happened as an eviction doesn't quite capture the reality. Andrew wasn't dragged from the property by court officers. and there was no legal order declaring his lease invalid. Instead, the financial foundation supporting his continued residence gradually disappeared. The legal right to stay remained on paper, but the practical ability to exercise that right became increasingly difficult. In effect, the institution didn't defeat the lease, it made the lease economically impossible to sustain. It's a remarkably subtle form of leverage. Rather than attacking the legal agreement itself, Charles altered the circumstances surrounding it. The paperwork remained largely intact, but the financial conditions that had allowed Andrew to benefit from that paperwork no longer existed. In the end, Royal Lodge wasn't reclaimed through a courtroom victory, it was reclaimed through economics. Andrew wasn't legally forced out. He was, in practical terms, financially starved out until leaving became the only realistic option. And he didn't go quietly. Reporting at the time described Andrew demanding compensation on the way out, not cash, but real estate. He reportedly wanted Frogmore Cottage, the home Harry and Meghan had vacated, and Adelaide Cottage, the residence currently used by William and Catherine's family, handed over for his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson. Read that again. A man being evicted for failing to meet the standards expected of the family was, in the same breath, asking to be handed the homes of the two royal households that had done the most to distance themselves from him. He didn't get either one. By January 2026, a deadline had been set. Easter, no extensions, and by February, reports placed Andrew moving his belongings not into some private mansion secured with his own money, the way Edward had done at Bagshot Park, but into Wood Farm, a modest 5-bedroom farmhouse on the Sandringham estate that had once belonged to Prince Philip. The symbolism wasn't subtle. The brother who spent 2 decades in a 30-room Grade 2 listed mansion was being relocated to the same modest cottage his own father had used as a retreat, not a residence of status. Then, on February 19, 2026, his 66th birthday, the entire situation escalated with remarkable speed. What had been unfolding as a slow-moving story about titles, finances, and royal property suddenly became something far more serious. On a day that would ordinarily have passed with little more than a brief palace acknowledgement, headlines instead reported that Thames Valley Police had arrested Prince Andrew as part of an ongoing investigation. The timing alone guaranteed worldwide attention. A birthday that might once have been marked by family gatherings and official messages instead became another deeply damaging chapter in the public story surrounding the Duke of York. According to reports at the time, the arrest centered on allegations of misconduct in public office linked to newly released material connected to Jeffrey Epstein. Investigators were also examining claims over whether Andrew had improperly shared confidential United Kingdom trade information during the period when he served as the country's special representative for international trade and investment. Those allegations represented a very different category of scrutiny from the controversies that had dominated headlines in previous years. The focus had shifted from reputational damage to questions being examined through the criminal justice system. Andrew was taken into custody, questioned for approximately 11 hours, and later released under investigation. That legal distinction is important. Being released under investigation is neither an exoneration nor a criminal charge. It simply means the investigation remains active while authorities continue gathering and assessing evidence before deciding whether any further action is appropriate. At that stage, no charges had been filed, but neither had the matter been brought to a conclusion. From the perspective of Buckingham Palace, however, the arrest changed the political landscape immediately. Whatever discussions had been taking place privately about Andrew's future within the royal family was suddenly overshadowed by an active police investigation receiving international attention. The controversy surrounding Royal Lodge, his titles, and his place within the monarchy was no longer unfolding in isolation. It was now taking place against the backdrop of a criminal investigation that placed even greater pressure on King Charles and the institution he represented. Whether or not the investigation ultimately resulted in charges, the arrest itself dramatically accelerated the palace's efforts to create greater distance between the crown and the king's younger brother. What happened next tells you everything about how differently this family now treats him. Charles didn't let the palace put out a routine statement. He signed his own, personally, as Charles R., a mark of personal authorship rather than institutional distance. In it, he said only that he'd learned of the situation with the deepest concern, and that the law had to be allowed to run its proper course. 9 words carrying an enormous amount of weight. He wasn't defending his brother. He was making sure everyone understood he wasn't going to. The property dominoes didn't stop with Royal Lodge. Just as attention was beginning to focus on Andrew's departure from his main residence, another, far less publicized property quietly entered the picture. In March, the BBC reported that Andrew had also been instructed to surrender the lease on East Lodge, a much smaller Grade 2 listed thatched cottage located within Windsor Great Park. Unlike Royal Lodge, East Lodge rarely appeared in headlines. It wasn't a grand mansion associated with royal ceremonies or official entertaining. Instead, it had been held since 1998 and was understood to be designated primarily for staff accommodation. Even so, it represented another valuable piece of Crown Estate property that Andrew had controlled for more than 2 decades. The financial arrangements were striking in their own right. Reports indicated that Andrew was paying less than $20,000 a year in rent for the cottage, a figure far below what comparable properties in the surrounding area would typically command on the open market. In one of the most desirable parts of the country, similar homes or even modern apartments nearby could often rent for many times that amount. Like so many royal property agreements, the lease reflected a relationship built on institutional trust rather than purely commercial terms. For years, East Lodge attracted almost no public attention. Overshadowed by the much larger Royal Lodge, it remained one of those quiet corners of the royal property portfolio that few people even realized Andrew still possessed. He continued holding the lease with little scrutiny, and there appeared to be no immediate effort to revisit the arrangement. Then something changed. According to the BBC's reporting, the timing of the surrender request closely followed a Freedom of Information request the broadcaster had submitted months earlier. The request sought detailed information about what Crown Estate properties Andrew still occupied and the terms under which he occupied them, including the rent being paid. On its own, an FOI request doesn't compel the Crown Estate to terminate a lease, but it does shine a light on arrangements that might otherwise remain unnoticed. Once those questions were formally asked, the existence of East Lodge and the unusually favorable terms attached to it was suddenly on the verge of becoming part of the public record. Soon afterward, the Crown Estate reportedly moved to recover the property. Whether the timing was coincidental or connected, the sequence was difficult to ignore. A lease that had existed quietly for more than 25 years suddenly came to an end, just as renewed public scrutiny focused on Andrew's remaining privileges. Viewed alongside the loss of Royal Lodge, the pattern became increasingly clear. This was no longer simply about one mansion. It was a systematic unwinding of Andrew's entire royal property footprint. One residence after another was being returned to Crown Estate control, steadily removing the network of housing arrangements that had supported his position inside the royal family for decades. By the time the process was complete, Andrew wasn't just leaving Royal Lodge, he was losing every Crown-linked residence that had defined his royal life. By April 2026, it was over. Royal Lodge, empty, handed back to Crown Estate management with renovations already being discussed. East Lodge surrendered. Andrew relocated to Wood Farm on privately funded terms. A man who once held 2 separate leased properties inside Windsor Great Park now held none. Here's the part that makes this story matter. Beyond one disgraced ex-royal though, this wasn't really about Andrew. It was a demonstration of exactly how much power the modern monarchy has to reclaim property from its own family, and exactly how it chooses to use that power selectively. Compare it to Edward, because the difference is striking once you look at the paperwork. Edward took on Bagshot Park in 1996, paying £5,000 a year in rent when the estate was in serious disrepair. Instead of relying on favourable royal terms indefinitely, he invested approximately £1.36 million of his own money restoring the property, turning a deteriorating mansion into a fully usable royal residence. Once those renovations were complete, the arrangement became far more commercial. his rent increased to a verified market rate of around £90,000 a year, reflecting the property's restored value rather than simply his royal status. Edward didn't stop there. In 2007, he secured a new 150-year lease through his own company in a deal reportedly worth £5 million. That wasn't just an extension of his tenancy, it substantially strengthened his legal interest in the property. The structure of the lease reportedly gave him the ability to sell the remaining value of that lease and retain the proceeds, making Bagshot Park function much more like a long-term commercial asset than a traditional royal residence. Every stage of Edward's occupancy added another layer of legal security backed by personal financial investment. His tenancy wasn't simply protected by royal privilege, it was reinforced by contracts, market value payments, and millions of pounds of his own money. Andrew's arrangement at Royal Lodge, by contrast, rested on a very different foundation. His lease carried a peppercorn rent, one so nominal that it only became payable if demanded. On paper, the lease appeared incredibly secure, stretching all the way to 2078. But unlike Edward's, it was never reinforced through the same pattern of commercial investment and increasingly robust legal agreements. Instead, it depended far more heavily on something impossible to write into any contract: the continued willingness of the royal family to leave it undisturbed. For more than 20 years, that was exactly what happened. Despite scandals, criticism, and growing public pressure, nobody wanted the constitutional headache or the global headlines that would come from forcing a prince out of his home. In practical terms, institutional goodwill became just as important as the lease itself. Once that goodwill disappeared, however, events moved with remarkable speed. Financial support ended, formal surrender notices were issued, and within a matter of months, a lease that had seemed untouchable for decades no longer protected Andrew in any meaningful way. The paperwork hadn't suddenly become weaker. The institution had simply stopped treating it as something worth defending. That's the real lesson sitting underneath this story. Royal property security was never actually about paperwork. It was about whether the family still had a reason to protect you. Edward's paperwork held because the family wanted it to hold. Andrew's didn't because the family had run out of reasons to keep him housed at all, no matter what any lease said on paper. And that raises the uncomfortable question hanging over every other lease still sitting inside Windsor Great Park and Sandringham right now. If a formally binding lease can be unwound in 6 months once the political will exists, then every other royal residency, the Wessexes at Bagshot Park, the Wales family at Adelaide Cottage, even Camilla's own arrangements, exists at the pleasure of whoever currently holds the throne, not because of the strength of the document itself. The family didn't need to break any rule to remove Andrew. They simply stopped extending the goodwill that made the rules irrelevant in his favor. That's a far more unsettling kind of power than an eviction notice, because it means the real document governing who gets to stay in these houses was never the lease. It's trust. And trust, unlike a 150-year lease, can be withdrawn at any time, for any reason, without a single signature changing. By the time Andrew moved the last of his belongings into Wood Farm, the family had made its point without ever needing to say it out loud. The next time anyone inside that family starts believing their position is permanent, they now have a very recent, very public example of exactly how fast permanent can turn out to be temporary.